should say I'm an anomaly in this conference. I do not do music. I do sound before it becomes music. And my project was to feel afresh what sound is. All sound is movement. In contrast to visible space, audible space is kinetic, mutable, materializing, dematerializing. It's this motility, perhaps, that accounts for our sense of sound as evanescent or hallucinatory, as if its objects belong to a less dense reality. For John Hall, a hearer who cannot see, it is a world of nothing but action. Every sound was a point of activity. Where nothing was happening, there was silence. For the blind, the world is void, unless something moves. Nothing in Hall's auditory space holds still. If it did, he would not perceive it. As the historian of sound, Jonathan Stern, puts it, sound is a little piece of the vibrating world. There are, in contrast to sound, in vision, there are no gaps or crevices. Vision is replete. The visible world is without spaces. The auditory world is episodic. And yet, its intermittency is what it gives audible effects power. Hall wrote, I hear distant tossing of trees across the park. It comes like a wave rolling across a beach. Now it breaks upon my body in a squall, a gust, like a fist. The strange presences that press upon the sighted from all sides as the surfaces of things, for the blind, are intermittent materializations. Hull inhabits a world that constructs and dismantles itself as he moves. In contrast, the perceived world, the visible world, is stable and continuous. The seen world cannot escape from your eyes. For him, the wind's body, massive and muscular, conjures up out of thin air those enormous presences we see looming over us, trees. But our trees are earthbound, rooted and trunked. His are hitched to the upper airs by their tiny sound makers, leaves. No thing makes a sound. All sounds are made by two things. A sound is not the sound of a thing moving. It is the sound of a thing moving up against another thing. The onomatopoeia of the words scrape, brush, flick retains this texture of touch. As Heidi notes, I hear not one voice, but at least a two in a duet of things. Stephen Connor, literary theorist, writes, when one hears a sound, one never hears just one thing. One hears the sound of contact, of echo, reverberation of one thing against another. Any sound is always at least two. Hearing requires contact, not skin-to-skin contact, but thing-to-thing contact. I hear the touch of objects. I participate in their tactile life. I am intimate by proxy with things I do not touch. Taste, touch, and smell require body and object to touch each other in order to perceive. Instead of separating the body from its object as seeing does, hearing connects the body to the object, but remotely. The sound maker vibrates itself and me as one, despite the space between us. It is as if we are in telekinetic communication, I and things heard. To hear, something must move. To taste, touch, or smell, something must move me. All the senses perceive movement. I taste, touch, or smell the movement up close. Either I move the perceptual object or it moves me. I hear movement at a distance. Objects move each other. Because visible objects can hold still, visibility sustains my impression of the world as stable. The other senses plunge me into the world's mutability. Their perceptual objects are discontinuous, under transformation, intermixed. Audible objects do not occlude one another as visible objects do. Multiple sounds blend, as do multiple tastes or touches. Multiple sights stay discrete. Touching attests to the discreteness of visible objects though not necessarily to their stability. Hearing insists upon their invisible mutability. The object I hear is not the thing that makes the sound. Hearing, like smelling, splits object from source. The source of the perception is material. Its object, the sound, the smell, is immaterial. We receive intimations of remote materialities. Sounds and smells detach themselves from the things that make them and travel to us through the air. Sights stick to their objects, but not to the body. Tastes and touches stick to both. Sight extinguishes itself on the surface of the skin of the eye. Smells and tastes get extinguished just under the skin, in the mouth of the nose. But sounds, like touches, travel through the body, as well as originate inside of it. Vibrating within, sounds and touches announce to me my own interior, as well as the interiors of objects. I pick up a box, Heidi's example. Things rattle, something gurgles, a weight shifts inside. What is sealed off from sight, smell, and taste is perceptible to touch and hearing. Sight, by contrast, stops at the skin surface at the same time that it fills up the world with surfaces. Only seeing offers a replete perceptual experience with no gaps and tears, and it offers it instantaneously. The other senses are episodic, intermittent, unfolding over time. Any sound is set off by its own silence. But this replete visual world opens up the space right before my eyes. The rest of the space around me is only audible. Hearing opens up the parts of the world vision occludes. I face the visible, permeated by the audible. This is the paradox of the senses. Each sense opens onto a different reality. All the senses open onto the same reality. How is this possible? Merleau-Ponty thought the secret of the senses is synaesthesia, the capacity of one perceptual experience to evoke the experience of another sense. All infants, I don't know if you know this, all infants are born synesthetic. All of you were synesthetic at one time. The neurologists, Canadian neurologists, Daphne and Charles Moreau, proposed that the newborn does not keep sensations separate from one another, but rather mixes sights, sounds, feelings, smells into a sensual bouillabaisse. Their neurological work confirms Paul Schilder's early mid-century psychoanalytic claim that there does not exist any primary isolation between the different senses. The isolation is secondary. We perceive, and we may with some difficulty, he argues, decide that part of the perception is based on optic perceptions. The synesthesia is therefore the normal condition. In most human beings, the synesthetic connections among the parts of the brain prune away with embodied experience so that infants come to separate out different senses from each other. In very few people in which this doesn't happen remain synesthetes all their lives. They get sprung. One sense springs the perceptual experience of another. So the separation of the senses is not a natural endowment, but a learned faculty. Merleau-Ponty thinks that it's only because of this trace of synesthesia in the body, despite their perceptual disparities, that all the senses open out onto the same world. The senses, he writes, intercommunicate by opening onto the structure of the thing. One sees the hardness and brittleness of glass, a tactile property, and when, with a tinkling sound, it breaks, the sound is conveyed by the visible shards. Because of the body's intersensorial unity, the look of a thing is already telling me what the thing feels like or what the thing sounds like. Any single perceptual sense portends what the whole thing is like. In the course of my ordinary engagements in the world, I am absorbed in my acts. I'm not paying attention to how I perceive. What Merleau-Ponty calls the arc of intentionality runs through the body, space, objects, and others. It's the unreflective perceptual modality Merleau-Ponty calls motor intentionality. In it, I do not think and then act. I act without having to think. My attention is turned toward the world, not toward my body. In this mode, perception, as my colleague Dora Abramson puts it, is agnostic as to modality. I get a world, regardless of which perceptual modality I'm getting it through. If I turn my attention to a particular sensory experience, which of course is your job here, everybody's, and thematize it in consciousness, to put it phenomenologically, I switch to the reflective perceptual modality Merleau-Ponty calls representational intentionality. In this mode, he writes, instead of yielding up my whole gaze to the world, I turn this gaze to itself. I turn my attention to my body and I think about what I perceive. Doing so, of course, is one of our particular pleasures. In music concerts, for instance, not only are other sounds muted in the interest of thematizing the music, but also lights are dimmed to mute vision, bodies are still to mute touch, food and drink are prohibited to mute taste and smell. This produces what the folklorist Barbara Christian Black-Gimbut calls single sense epiphanies. Merleau-Ponty writes about being a musical concert. When in the concert hall, I open my eyes. The visible space seems to me cramped compared to that other space through which a moment ago the music was being unfolded. And even if I keep my eyes open while the piece is being played, I have the impression that the music is not really contained within this circumscribed and unimpressive space. It brings a new dimension stealing through visible space, and in this it surges forward, just as in victims of hallucinations, the clear space of things perceived is mysteriously duplicated by a dark space in which other presences are visible. End of quote. The musical architecture, by which I mean the space the sound carves out, exceeds the visible dimensions of the hall in which it's played. It creates another space which paradoxically takes up the same space. Music, Merleau-Ponty writes, is not in visible space, but it besieges, undermines, and displaces that space. Stephen Connor writes, sound, as Michel Chion has emphasized, has no frame. There is nothing to hold it in, so there's nothing to hold it in. The audible is at once more, less, and other than the visible. So although each sense opens onto the real, one sense does not neatly fill in the gaps in the other senses. It's not like a jigsaw puzzle that fits together reality. Each sense pulls on, pushes against, distorts, intensifies, shrinks, or expands the others. This resonant incommensurability of the senses is what gives perception its depth, its richness, and its inexhaustibility. Objects present themselves as horizons of possibility, as Hubert Dreyfus puts it, rather than completed things. They do not portend, they portend what they do not yet present. This portentousness gives the perceptual world its accent of reality. In Alfred Schütz's term, there's always more to it. Sound is not suspended in space between vibrating bodies. It gets under my skin. I perceive it as both a disturbance in the air and a disturbance of my tissues. The audible world is at once episodic and pervasive, outside and inside the bottle, impalpable and felt in the bones. Stephen Connor writes, one apparent paradox of hearing is that it strikes us as at once intensely corporeal, sound literally moves, shakes, and touches us, and mysteriously immaterial. Perhaps the tactility of sound depends in part on this immaterial corporeality, because of the fact that all sound is disembodied, a residue or production, rather than the property of objects. End quote. If I speak, my voice vibrates within me. It accrues body. Thought, spoken, is fleshed and boned. Media scholar Douglas Kahn writes, while other people hear a person's voice carried through vibrations in the air, the person speaking also hears his or her own voice as it is conducted from the throat and mouth through bone to the inner regions of the ear. Yet at the same time that the speaker hears the voice, full with the immediacy of the body, others will hear the speaker's voice infused with a lesser distribution of body, because it will be a voice heard without bone conduction, a deboned voice. Hearing materializes the body. I resonate with myself. I turn in on myself as I am turned toward the world. This is not passive perception, a body pelted by audible pings. I and the world are co-animated. Lee Eric Schmidt, religious historian, points out that one's assumptions about the passivity of hearing, in contrast to the activity of seeing, are critically engaged rather than presumed. Hearing's capacity for a similarly spirited interchange becomes recognizable, a dialogic movement between speaker and listener, a sympathetic vibration between sounding bodies. It's possible, that is, for the voice of the other to vibrate within me as does my own. If it does, I am entered into an intimacy such as to extinguish difference. Doug McClure, the poet who invented what he called meat language, writes about his conversation with a leopard in the zoo, with which I will conclude these remarks. She puts her face within an inch of the wire and speaks to me. The growl begins instantly and almost without musical attack. It begins gutturally. It grows in volume and it expands till I can feel the interior of her body, from whence the energy of the growl extends itself as it gains full volume of fury. It extends itself vibrating and looping, then still with the full capacity of untapped energy. The growl drops in volume and changes in pitch to a hiss. The flecks of her saliva spatter my face. I feel not smirched, but cleansed. Her eyes are fixed on me. The growl, without a freshly drawn breath, begins again. It is a language I understand more clearly than any other. I hear rage, anger, anguish, warning, pain, even fury, humor, all bound in one statement. I am surrounded by the physicality of her speech. It is a real thing in the air. It absorbs me, and I can hear and see and feel nothing else. Her face and features disappear, becoming one entity with her speech. The speech is the purest, most perfect music I have ever heard. And I know that I am touched by the divine. On my cheeks, on my brow, on the tympanums of my ears, and the vibrations on my chest, and on the inner organs perception. Thank you.